I want to take a deep dive into the world of football player statistics. My name's Tom Brownlee from Bookiebashing. These kind of analytical reviews of betting edges is what we do over here. If you're looking more for content like this,
he's the one with all the tips. Ooh, yeah. Winning horses.
Then maybe I can suggest you turn the video off. Don't need to read the report. You can move on, because there's a world of charlatans out there that will celebrate, short-term variance when they get a few winners, and they don't have documented long-term profit loss reports. But actually this video is going to be something different to a ROI, return on investment, which is easy to do when you've got lots of different back odds. But let's go a little bit further when we're looking at player statistics to really have a look at how we can model them and how we can prove what we're modeling is giving us a tangible edge over the market or not. So, player statistics, talking about shots on target, shots, passes, tackles, saves, assists. I'm not going to use the word soccer, sorry American friends, in football. We look at these kind of markets because, well, they're weaker, they're less efficient. You can get a wider range of odds, both on the over and the under. And it's very critical that we're betting on both of those for reasons I will explain later on in the video. And this wider range of odds, wider range of opinion is much bigger than something like match odds or even over 2.5. Look, if you want to be over 2.5 goals in a match, you better be damn good at it, because we looked at the English Premier League Championship and the top leagues in France, Germany, Spain and Italy. And since 2022, the market makers, the traders, the odds compilers, the guys setting the lines have been accurate to within 0.7%. They're really, really good at estimating the number of goals that are going to be in a game in the long run. They're not as good, they're not as accurate on player statistics. They can't be, and that's where we get our edge. So in this video, primarily I'm going to be looking at how accurate we are with something called expectancy, because it's very easy for me to say to you, I think Haaland's going to get 1.5 shots on target tomorrow. But what does that mean? And how can I hold myself accountable to a level that is very different than perhaps other services and other tipsters out there? Because at Bookiebashing, we hold ourselves to very, very high levels. And what we've come up with, we believe, is sort of a level that is a first in the punter side of the industry. Certainly you might get these kind of analytics on the bookmaker's side. Let's try and apply it on the punter side. So going back to Haaland, just betting 101. Someone might say, I think Haaland's going to score tonight. Well, that means nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. Or Haaland's going to get a shot on target tonight. So what? Then they might say, well, he's had 5 shots on target in the last 5 games, so he's averaging 1 a game. So what? Right? 1, is that applicable to the game coming up? And 2, how does that apply to your odds that you're betting at? You see, you need to at least be telling me that you think Haaland should be evens, and you can get 6 to 5, 6 to 4 on him. On either side, that could be the over or the under. But how did you get to evens? Well, to get to evens, we need to be talking about expectancies in very, very large numbers if we're going to be pointing to this data and trying to elicit some sort of proof from the data that our model is in any way accurate. Because if we're constantly optimistic, then when we're backing, we're going to be losing money. If we're constantly pessimistic, then when we're laying, we're going to be losing money. So we need to actually prove that we're accurate, and maybe accurate to a point that is more accurate than the markets with which we're betting into. Be that at soft bookmakers, your Bet365s, in your shops, or even on exchanges if we are market making, if we are trading, if we are seeding. So let's talk about these expectancies. That's the number. We're talking about Haaland having 1.51 shots on target tomorrow night. That is one data point, that 1.51. And I now want to have a look at an in-depth review of tens of thousands of data points to see how accurate we can be. The one thing, unfortunately, I cannot do, which we've learned over time at Bookiebashing, is I can't really discuss my input sources, where the data is coming from, nor can I discuss really in too much detail the methodology, because what happens is it just gets copied and cloned and sent to too many people. You get too many people using an edge. It's the tragedy of the commons, the edge goes away. You can't have too many people getting involved. But what I can say is that at Bookiebashing, with everything that we have, be it horse racing or golf or football, we use what is called a hybrid model for deriving an edge in betting markets. And that hybrid model means that we do a combination of pricing things and using probability models that we've built in-house, whilst really, really looking at what the markets are doing and following the markets, because there's so much information out there in the markets that we would be foolish not to listen to it. At the same time, if all we're doing is deriving numbers in-house and not listening to the markets, then our standalone models have to all be better than what is out there in the markets. And so what we do is we take our standalone model and we combine it with what's in the markets, a sort of hybrid bit of market analysis feeding back in, which feeds back into the market, which feeds back into the model. And through series of iterations and heuristic reviews, we hope that we end up with a very, very accurate model. When we look at how we have performed, the accuracy of our model, we are going to obviously have to consider the fact that different players will have different expectancies in the game. For example, in the Man City match tonight, we have Ruben Diaz down here with 0.23 expected shots on target. But as we move through to the midfield with Kevin De Bruyne, he has 0.71, Kovacic 0.25, Savio 0.6, and then we get Foden with 0.84, and up front Mamouche 0.72 and Haaland with 1.44. Now, when looking at a single game, obviously Haaland can either get 0 or 1 or 2, or he might even get 7 shots on target tonight. What does that mean about our expectancy of 1.44? We can't prove anything from a single game. We might know that the odds of him getting a shot on target are around about 1.25 when he's got an expectancy of 1.44. So if we're getting even money, obviously we've got a good bet. That doesn't mean that our model was accurate or inaccurate. Looking at one game doesn't help us. We need to look at a lot of games. And sometimes players don't play enough games for us to have something that is statistically relevant. For example, Ruben Diaz isn't going to get that many shots on target. In fact, let's take a Kanji at 0.11. He's only going to get a shot on target once every 9 games with that level of expectancy. Now, how many games is a Kanji going to play in a season? 30? 40 at most, if you consider the cups? You know, with 40 games, he's going to get 4.44 expected shots on target if he has the same number of shots on target expected in a game for all the rest of the games as he does in this Champions League game tonight. Perhaps he might have a few more against the Wolverhampton Wanderers in the Premiership. But let's say he's played these 40 games over the season and he got 3 shots on target, or 4, or 5. Does any of that give us information about the accuracy of our model? You know, he can't get 4.44 shots on target. He either has to get 4 or 5 or less or more. So when looking at the accuracy of our shots on target model, we're not just going to have to take multiple games for each player, but we're going to have to take multiple players over multiple games to get a sample size that is big enough for us to determine the accuracy. We can do that though. It is possible. What we're actually going to be doing is looking at expectancies. We're going to take all the players down at 0.11 and all the players at 0.2 and all the players at 1.44. We'll find a way of dividing our statistics into percentiles and we'll look at these ranges and how they perform. Because it's one thing if everything performs well, but how are the really high expectations performing? How are the really low expectations performing? We'll never get everything to perform exactly the same, but that will bring us to the next question of what ranges are important. For every statistic and for every percentile within that statistic, we'll be able to plot on average that perhaps it's accurate to 100.5% with a range that is between 110% and 90%. I'm just making these numbers up just now, but this could be the shots on target range. And the question we ask ourselves is 110% optimistic good enough? Is 90% pessimistic good enough? Actually, that question comes down to the EV with which you're betting at. If you're betting very thin, then you need narrower confidence in your ranges. And if you're betting very large EV, you're filtering out everything under 120% and only betting over 120%. You can get away with slightly larger ranges. So we're going to look at the percentiles, the different magnitudes of the player stats. And we're going to look at the acceptable ranges. And then one more thing we're going to look at is how we're behaving over time. You see, we can track the results over time, and they do interesting things when we do that. So let's talk about shots on target specifically, but we could talk about any player stat here. We might start off with an average of 0.7 shots on target for every player that we're tracking. What we'll find when we look at the actual results of what happens is there are deviations in the market. Sometimes it goes down, sometimes it goes up. It's never exactly 0.75, is it? Sometimes there might be a tangible reason why it starts to go up, because maybe they play more playing time at the end of the first and the second half, as referees have been given that directive. Maybe it starts to go down because there's a tangible reason why managers have said we want to be tighter, we want better defence, we want fewer shots on target. So when we look at results, there's always these shifts. Then we can plot what the market is doing against those results. So we tend to find that the market follows results just with this little time delay. So when the results change, the markets follow, but sometime afterwards. What we want to do as advantage players is we want to minimise the length of time it takes for us to react to changes in the market. So it's the length of time that we want to minimise, and we also want to minimise the difference between what we are predicting and what the results are saying. So if the results are showing 0.75, we want to be as close to 0.75 as possible, acknowledging that we can never be 100% accurate. We just need to be accurate enough so that the EV that we're betting at is going to be profitable given the accuracy of the models that we're using for player shots on target. So let's take a look at an example of a player statistics bet. Here we have Monaco versus Benfica tonight. It's a little bit early, it's a few hours beforehand. Nothing's really been traded in first goal scorer, anytime goal scorer. Actually, nothing's been traded in shots on target either, but it's these kind of bets that over the day, sometimes the liquidity in these markets can supersede the goal scorer markets, occasionally even the match odds markets, maybe not in a Champions League game, but certainly in some games. I've seen it happen in a championship game where a player to have a shot on target had more traded on it than the match odds did. But let's go over to BetDAC, and here we see Dennis Zakaria to have 3 or more fouls committed versus Benfica, back 6.4, lay 6.5, £25,000 matched on this, a significant amount, all between sort of 6 and 7. So the question is, what is the fair odds of this? Well, I could tell you that he's had 3 fouls in the last game, but what does that mean? In fact, he's had 3 fouls in the last 2 games for Monaco. He's had 7 fouls in the last 4 games, which would equate to about 1.75 fouls per game. But all of those things, they don't factor in the relative strength of their Champions League opponents tonight against Benfica. Now, if I go over to the match centre here, for Monaco Benfica tonight. If I pop over to fouls, I see Dennis Zakaria here. We have an expectancy of 1.79 fouls in this game. Sort of ties in with his 7 fouls from 4 games, which would be 1.75. The over 0, so 1 or more odds are 1.2. And if I just raise this up to over 2, I get 3.75. Now, that's quite a big bet. That's a back of 6, maybe 6.5, even 6.7's been going. Fair odds are 3.75. That's nearly 200% EV. So I guess the question you might ask is, how do I trust that this 1.79 figure is in any way accurate? Which is really what we want to talk about in this video, in this report. One thing that I cannot stand is when people give no credence, no explanation to the numbers that they show. And let's just pop over to Odds Checker at Twitter. And here, Odds Checker are talking about the Inter versus Fiorentina match, and they say that Keane has had 5 shots, 4 on target, and some recent relevant stats that really aren't important because they don't consider the relative strength of their opponents. Always be very wary about these sort of recent stats things that are thrown out. But here we say our plus EV tool has identified value in him getting a shot on target, and they say the AI probability is 56.99. What in a month of Sundays is AI probability? Artificial intelligence probability. You can't just put artificial intelligence in front of something and then expect people to believe, well, that's got to be the number then. Although I think quite a lot of people do that. I mean, what is that, about 1.8 something? Paddy Power is saying 1.91. In my mind, I actually trust the Paddy Power odds compiler a lot more than I do Chat GPT. Regardless, the argument here seems to be that AI probability is somehow trustworthy. So show me something. Show me some historical return on investment, profit, loss figures. Even better, show me how expectancy, how this probability matches recorded results over time. If you cannot do that, then you're asking me to blindly trust, and quite frankly, that's unacceptable. Now, back at Bookiebashing, looking at our model, and this applies to all models, I'm just using Bookiebashing as an example, we have this 3.75 for over 2 fouls because the expectancy is 1.79. My question has to be, how does that expectancy of 1.79 stand up in the long run? We do have and store all archive figures at Bookiebashing. Anyone can access them. The hard thing is tying them up against results and looking at what this expectancy is doing, certainly as well across different percentile thresholds of magnitude. How are the lower guys doing at 0.8? How are the bigger guys doing? You know, Dennis is one of the bigger guys there at 1.79. How are they all performing against results? Now we've said all of that, let's jump into the data. So we've got a lot of historical data at Bookiebashing. We log every single line. And that's really important. If you're running your model, you can't just be pointing to a handful of data points. You need a lot of information. And the more that you have, actually, the better your model will be, especially if you've got a kind of feedback mechanism. And that's exactly what we run at Bookiebashing. Now, I can't give away the exact methodology of how we price up the expectancy of our player statistics. What I can say is we run a heuristic empirical model, meaning 2 different things there. Heuristic, you look back at your model to see how it's performing, and you optimize it based on that historical performance. And empirical meaning you're looking out at the markets and you're getting data that is out there, reading observations as an input into your model. So it's those 2 different things. It's collecting information, but it's also looking backwards to optimize the data. And that allows us actually to have very, very, very accurate models when we're looking at entire data sets as a whole. When we're looking at percentiles of magnitude within that data set, that's when we get slight variations, because you can't optimize. It can't be 100% for everything. Something's got to give some give. It's the same with the odds compilers out there. It's the same with us. Let's give an example. Shots on target. Here's a table. I'm not going to give you too many tables because it's just a lot of numbers. I'm going to try and focus on the graphs, but you'll see all these tables in the report. I just want to touch on the shots on target because the sample size here is really significant. We have 45,919 players that we have logged data for in the Premier League, the Championship, La Liga, in League One, in Bundesliga and Serie A. And we've taken these 45,919 players and we've looked at our expected shots on target. It was 24,049 in total. And when we looked at how many there were 24,120. That's accurate to within 100.29%. That's super accurate. Okay, it's not an accident that it is that accurate because of the way we optimize and calibrate the model over time. These players, by the way, they were all starting. So if somebody has shots on target but they're not starting, they hopefully get eliminated from our tool, but we don't have them in the data set. So we don't have a guy that came on in the 88th minute. You know, he might have had his pre-lineup expectancy attached to him, and if you laid him and he came on in the 88th minute, you're quids in. But we are only looking at players that started the match, and we're looking at closing lines. Okay, so we're looking at the line right at kickoff, because lines change over the day, over a few days. We have a number of different lines, but we're trying to use the closing lines for this particular analysis. Now, we've taken these 45,919 players, and we've tried to divide them into roughly 20 equal-sized percentile groups. We did that for shots on target, different statistics. It was more appropriate to use a different number of percentile groups. So some have got more than others, some have got 3,000, some have got 1,900, but they're roughly the same. And what our second objective is, our first objective is that the overall data set is as accurate as possible, but we have a second objective, certainly in shots on target, and that is that the players with the higher shots on target, the higher expectancies, are as accurate as possible. Our argument there being there's more money going down on your Haalands, on your Lewandowskis, on your Kanes, than there is on your right backs, on your defenders. That doesn't mean that we don't want the right backs and the defenders to be incorrect or inaccurate. It's just if we have to choose where the accuracy fit applies best, it's going to be on the strikers, it's going to be on the players with the highest expectancies. And with the top 20th percentile, that's players with shots on target expectancy of 1.08 to 2.6. We predicted 3,050.01 shots on target, and there were 3,051. So super accurate for those, you know, top 20th percentile, band at 100.03%. Actually, going back in the 19th, 18th, 17th, 16th percentile, everybody with a shots on target over 0.67% is at worst 1.57% different to the results that were recorded, and that's really, really good. Now, what effect do these ranges have in terms of accuracy? I mean, the worst range here we have is 0.51 to 0.55. We predicted 1,146, there were 1,251, that's 109%. Well, have a look at this as an example, okay? This is a little table I've just drafted up with somebody with a kind of median expectancy of shots on target of 0.89. Okay, that's 1.697 fair odds to get a shot on target. Okay, so if you're looking at backing, which I've classified as overs here, the EV you would be looking at is about 100%. And the unders is what I mean by laying. And again, because we're confident that the fair odds are completely accurate, you can bet 100.00001% EV and you'll be okay. What about at 109%? Well, that accuracy is the difference between fair odds of 1.69 and 1.61. Meaning that if we're backing with overs at an EV of 105% or more, that's enough to account for the margin of error in this data set. At this, and we're talking about, by the way, the worst performing percentile out of 20 percentiles at 0.51. If we're looking at somebody with really high percentiles, there's only a deviation in the accuracy of the results of 0.03%. You can pretty much bet at any EV at that. So this is as bad as it's getting, and I hope that just gives a little bit of an indication about, you know, worst case scenario, the worst 20th percentile, you should be looking at 105% EV or more, and you'll be okay in the long run. Right, going back to the shots on target, let's take a look at this next slide here. So I've taken that table and I've plotted it on this graph. It just allows us to see how we deviate away from 100% across the different percentiles. Okay, and the goal always is to get all of these data points as close to 100% as possible, whilst acknowledging that we can't get them all at 100%. There's no algorithm out there that will do that. No one can predict shots on target exactly accurately across every single threshold and day of the week, and left-footed and right-footed players, and players that begin alphabetically with A, B, C in their surname. That's not possible. But if you are going to divide a data set up into percentiles, getting them all as close down to a reasonable level, as a reasonable being a subjective number, but a reasonable level as close to 100% as possible, is what we want to do. I've then had a look at the deviation by competition, because I think some competitions you're going to have more confident data sets than others. Actually, it was the German Bundesliga that performed the best, albeit the sample size is a little bit like half of the Premiership there. Maybe there's a bit of noise in that. Then it was La Liga and the English Premier League. On the other side of the coin, the French League One was quite pessimistic. Italian Serie A was quite optimistic. I don't really take a lot out of these graphs. Others might, but I just thought that it was interesting to look at. And finally, can we look at how things have performed over time? Now, on this graph here, anything over 100%, we're pessimistic. Anything under 100%, we are optimistic. And what we see at the beginning is just swings that have very little pattern to them. And I would classify these as noise. Up, down, month after month, it's just noise. So every month, we're seeing either pessimism, optimism, pessimism, optimism, pessimism, optimism. And then there's a few months of pessimism in a row. Maybe that suggests something. Maybe there's a bit of market overcorrection that had to happen. But very interestingly, the tool did overestimate to the greatest degree around about late October, November 2024, and it continued to do so in December 2024. Leading up to then, our tool had been pessimistic. It was underestimating shots on target. And what we heard on support was people were making a lot of money through the summer and beginning of the season, and people were losing a lot of money later on in the season. And people had suggested mostly that they were backing or they were betting overs relative to unders and laying. It was a lot more of that. And the number of support tickets that we got saying that mirrored what we see in this graph here. And we can actually protect ourselves against market inaccuracies of overestimating and underestimating by employing a strategy where we do both backing and laying in equal amounts. It's not going to happen. We're not going to do it in exactly equal amounts. Sometimes the value is all going to be here. Sometimes the value is all going to be there. But if you just back, then you're at the mercy of the markets sort of being optimistic. And if you just lay, you're at the mercy and you're going to be losing money if the markets are underestimating and being pessimistic. We can never know in any given month what the market is doing, but if we're employing a strategy of backing and laying or overs and unders, then we protect ourselves against that. Over the long run, over years and years, if you're just doing one strategy, it'll be fine. I'm just suggesting this for balancing or evening out short-term variance and volatility to stop having these big winning and then big losing swings in our portfolio. Okay, so that's shots on target. Okay, as we look at shots, we had a lot of shots. We expected 53,433. We got 53,652. That's 38,000 players there, sample size. That's accurate to within 100.4%. Just a little bit pessimistic, the side I'd like to be on. The top percentile is optimistic. It's not ideal, but within a percent is okay. I mean, I'd rather it was pessimistic than optimistic. That top percentile is 2.59 to 6.2. 6.2 is a lot of shots for a player in a match. I wonder who that was. We do have 12 percentiles overall for this data set. But still, yeah, predicted 9,669. We recorded 9,575. And the rest of the shots, they're relatively well sort of positioned. They're accurate, other than the very first percentile, which is actually just above the graph there at 112% accuracy. If we look at how shots are performing compared to other tools in terms of their volatility, or other statistics compared to their volatility, have a look at this graph. And here we see shots, they're quite narrow at 100%, and that's what you want. You want the range to be narrow. But ideally, I mean, the goal when we're designing these models is we want things at minimum to be within 80 to 120%. And we're really talking about, remember, the outliers of the percentiles there. The worst performing percentile at 80 to 120% would be okay. And we want all of our predictions, all of our models to sit within that range. And very good would be everything sitting between 90 and 110. So we're just outside that with passes. Just a little outlier with shots, but the rest of shots really is accurate to quite a good degree, certainly relative to other statistics. Fouls is quite a range. It's the biggest range that we have. Shots on target team and shots for player are probably the more accurate statistics, but all of these ranges are within what we would want when we're building a model like this. If they were all sitting outside of 80 to 120%, we have a lot of inaccuracy in our estimations, and that means that our over 0, over 1, over 2, shots on target, fouls, odds are going to be too far off to be backing and laying and making a profit. It's within that range, especially, that the outlier percentiles being quite narrow, and then the majority of the data being in that 100, 101, 102, 103% region. That's what we want, and that's what we've got. So that is shots. If we look at shots over time, we see the same sort of graph, the same sort of pattern that we saw with shots on target, and that is the beginning of the season through to the summer. We sort of, at the end of the summer, we saw this period where we were pessimistic, where we were underestimating the number of shots. We were getting more, but recently it's been the other way around. There's been overestimation, but in the long run, it has been fine. And again, we can balance all of that out with a strategy that employs both backing and laying, and that will correct for any sort of market over and underestimation, because any given month we cannot know where we are until we look back at the data. We don't know what's going on today. It's a little bit like Schrodinger's cat. The minute we look at it is the minute that the data changes. Next up is fouls. Here we probably have the widest range in our percentiles, and we have 3,500 players to look at. 8 percentiles, we chopped it up between 0 and 2.94 expected fouls in the match. Overall, really good when you put them all together. 3,667 predicted, 3,662 recorded. Pessimistic, but only 0.1% off. And the top percentile, the 1.53 and above expected fouls, very good at 100.26. Just a couple in between the lower expectations. Some were very pessimistic, some were very optimistic. So maybe just something to keep an eye out there. If we're betting at very low expectations of expected fouls, up at 10 to 1 perhaps, that's where we would want to be having a good threshold of EV, maybe up at 7, 8, 9, 10% before we start betting. But as always, as we are betting at higher odds, we should be betting at higher EV anyway, regardless. And this sort of just ties in with that. As we look at fouls over time, when I look at a graph like this, I just see noise. I don't see much signal at all. When you go pessimistic, optimistic, pessimistic, optimistic, pessimistic, optimistic, and then we finish very pessimistic, I just see that there is no real pattern here. And so I'm not going to draw too much out of the information that a graph like that throws out to me. Other than last month, we were very, very pessimistic. So that would be a good month for backers looking at fouls, which is slightly different to shots and target. But then we would not expect much correlation between those two statistics anyway. Tackles is quite a fun one. Just not only did we have a lot of data, but how close we actually managed to get that data when we do our heuristic empirical optimization. 6,345 players divided up, I think, into 16 categories we did here, 16 percentiles. Overall, we expected 10,671. There were 10,677. Top percentile, 1,070 expected, 1,069. recorded. I mean, can you get any closer than that? Well, you can get one closer than that, can't you? And not much range as well. I mean, the worst performing, maybe the very lowest guys, the 0 to 0.93 expected tackles in the game, still 106.2% would be okay. Actually, there's one in the middle, 2.02 to 2.17, that's about 107%. But I mean, those are great. Very happy with the range of accuracy that we got across the different percentiles when we did our latest optimization on that tool. So next up, player cards is very interesting, mostly interesting because of the way that the markets behave, which is not something you can really see in this graph. So we'll quickly move on from this, but you can see here, I think we've got 10 percentiles, and we predicted 2,907 cards. That was a little tiny bit optimistic. There were 2,883, still within a percent. The top percentile, 396.4 were expected, 395 were recorded. But it wasn't so much that, it's the swing and the changes in the markets. You see, first of all, if we look at how the trend is going over time, we see a very, very large swing going from pessimism, where we're predicting some cards and we're getting loads more than that, to the other way around, where we're predicting loads of cards and quite few are being recorded relative to how many that we are predicting. But I did a video on this recently, and it showed this graph here, and it was having a look at what the market has been doing this season in terms of exact number of cards. It's predicting at the beginning 4.3 per game. There were 4.6 per game. Because there were 0.3 cards per game on average across the top 4 leagues in Europe and the Premier League and the Championship, that's a lot when you're looking at averages, getting 0.3 per game more cards. And that meant that backers were cleaning up because there were just more cards than the odds were predicting. And then two things happened simultaneously. The markets adjusted their expectations, where they changed from 4.3 up to 4.5, 4.55. But also something happened on the pitch where there were fewer and fewer cards per game. And it swapped around, and now, later on in the season, we're expecting more cards than are actually being recorded. And this is tied in with backers getting in touch with us from August, September, October, telling us how much money they're making. And then people getting in touch with us November, December, January, telling me how much they're losing, sending in bet histories. Look, we only ever get bet histories during losing runs. We don't get sent them during winning runs. The virtual double at Betfred hasn't won in a month or two. We're going to be asked for full histories and ROI figures, and some confidence needs to be sort of given out to people. Whereas during a period where 2 or 3 will win in a week, we don't hear anything. It's complete silence. It's been the same with the bet histories coming through. But there is very much a tie-in with those bet histories. People doing majority backing, especially in player cards. Way more common for people to be backing and laying. It's easy for me to say, look, mix up backing and laying. But often player cards are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Very, very rarely, in fact, never, I think, do you get odds on player cards. And so there is the fave long shot bias in place, where people might not want to be laying at very, very short odds, especially since you can't Dutch lay player stats and manage your liability. Having said that, the only way, if we're not going to be mixing a strategy of backing and laying that we can protect ourselves, is to be using sort of stricter levels of EV filtering and threshold. Now, that's only in periods when the market is being a little bit optimistic, and at Bookiebashing we have a close eye on this, and we're doing our best to watch what the market's doing and calibrate our models specifically to account for this over and under sort of estimation in the markets. And given that over all of our player cards we expected 2,907, we recorded 2,883, it's not too bad. It's within a single percent. Could be better, but it's a long-term game. We've been recording these for quite a lot of time, the player cards. I thought it might be interesting just to see if there's any pattern or pessimism or optimism happening across the different leagues, and certainly Serie A is optimistic. There have been, 89% of the cards relative to what we predicted That's definitely a competition to keep an eye on. So this is also the smallest sample size as well, which could have something to do with that. And then looking at the pessimism, French League One, again, only 953 players have been documented there. English Premier League as well, just marginally pessimistic at 103, 103%. Right, moving on into player passes. There was a lot of data for player passes, which makes it quite fun to do the analysis. To say that we were able to chunk up quite a lot of thresholds due to the high numbers and the sample size that we were dealing with. So I think we had 20 in this graph, and that was only 1,409 players, but 71,350 passes in total. 71,000, that was expected, 71,467 recorded for 100.2% for the data set as a whole. The first percentile at 110.52%. So players that are really, really high odds, the low expectancies, 0 to 27 passes, we're just struggling a little bit. Just can't get that under 10%. But when we go up to the highest percentiles, the players that pass it around, the Bruno Fernandez's and all those guys, 99.66% is the accuracy, right up at the top with 7,174 expected, 7,150 recorded. Tiny little bit of optimism in there, but we're talking about very fine numbers, so it's okay. Yeah, I found that an interesting data set. And maybe one more. Shall we have a look at saves? X saves review. So saves slightly harder to get a lot of data because, of course, there's only 2 players per game that are going to get saves for you. So we have fewer percentiles that we were able to divvy this up on. But we were looking at 0 to 2.31 on the lower end. Probably, a heavy favourite that's not going to get that many shots on target in their direction, and then 3.8 to 5.85 on the other side. 2,058 players, although that would be about 1,030 games, and looking at both home and away in those games. We expected 6,162, only got 6,063, so that's optimistic, and it's the worst kind of optimism that we have. Interestingly, though, not much pattern between the 2 highest expectancies there. One of them is optimistic, the second highest expectancy. The next one's pessimistic. Add them both together. Actually, together they behave okay. So saves it's one of those, I think we just need a little bit more data because we're only getting 2 players in a game, and that's why we have a little bit more uncertainty. And if we want to see how it's trending over time, maybe there's a pattern there where for a while there was some underestimating going on. There was some pessimism, and it's been corrected into optimism, and then there's been some recent, but I mean, we're talking about very small sample sizes, very recent data. I mean, half of this graph is pretty much the season from the start of 2024-25 up until February. So we seem to be at the moment in time in a period of time where we're sort of expecting 100% accuracy that are getting recorded, so that's not too bad. So that's our review of the player statistics model, and that's the one that we have at Bookiebashing. But if you've got your own, what I do suggest to you is that data is king. It is absolutely key. As mentioned, we employ this empirical heuristic optimization model. If I break that down, what I mean is that we observe what's going on in the markets, bring that information in, and then look at what we've seen historically to optimize the data that we see at the current day to make sure that our predictions from when we started recording information up until now are as close to 100% as possible. Because if those expectancies are as close to 100%, then we know that our over 0, over 1, over 2, over 43 passes, those numbers are correct, or if not correct, they're accurate enough that they're beating the markets. I mean, this is a sophisticated way of going around it. When you look at what odds compilers are doing for the bookmakers, they can get away with a little less amount of sophistication simply because of 2 things: the margin that they employ and the playing time of whether, your man might come on in the 90th minute as a substitute or come off in the 3rd minute. Although those things are factored in slightly into the numbers, you can't really factor in your man going off in the 5th minute injured. And the edge that the bookmakers have, both from the margin and those deviations in playing time and substitutes, is so considerable that the levels of accuracy that they need don't actually need to come as close as what we're doing as Vantage players, especially if we're betting on exchanges, seeding markets, backing and laying. And that leads into my point about what you would do as a strategy. We can talk about the data and how you manage your data, and data is king, and you should always be looking at it, identifying what the markets are doing and taking advantage as necessary, whether you think they are over-predicting or under-predicting, because the markets are very rarely ever at 100%. But what can you personally be doing in your betting? Well, firstly, EV thresholds are key. Now, can you ever just bet at 100.1%? I'd argue in something like shots on target, where you calibrate your model, like we have done, to be as efficient as possible on the guys with the highest expectancies, the Lewandowskis, the Haalands, the Salahs. You probably could be backing and laying at 100.1%, although you strap yourself in for the volatility and variance that comes with betting so thin. And if you're Kelly staking, you're not going to be getting much down on that at all. EV thresholds are very useful, not just for staking a little bit higher, making a little bit more ROI, but also for the confidence in the mathematics, right? Once you're staking at 110% EV and higher, no matter which percentile you're choosing, you should pretty much have some accuracy and some confidence in your historical numbers that they have been profitable over time. 120% definitely. And it sort of depends on who it is and what it is that you're betting on and how much you can play around with those EV thresholds. That's the first thing. The second thing, as discussed, is that we don't know at any given time what the market's doing, if it's over-predicting or under-predicting, if we are being optimistic or pessimistic. If we knew, we would adjust everything to be 100%, but at any given time we don't know that. We can only know it when we're looking backwards. And because of that, we are at the mercy, especially with things like player cards, as this season has shown, of whether the odds are good enough, whether there is enough expectancy out there compared to what's happening on the pitch. And how do we protect ourselves against something like that? Well, two ways of doing that. Just give it a long enough sample size, 1 year, 2 year, and enough bets, things will balance themselves out over that period of time. Or if we want a shorter time period than that, not everybody can wait for 2 years. Mix up the strategy with backing and laying. Yes, I know fave long shot bias in something like player cards makes it very difficult to be laying a lot of players at 7 to 1, 8 to 1, 9 to 1, 10 to 1. Shots on target, plenty of odds on players. Mbappe down at 1.2. If we're laying that, then that's the equivalent of backing not to get a shot on target at 6.0. And that takes account of our fave long shot problems, where a lot of people don't want to put loads of money down to win very little. Well, laying 1.2 isn't difficult, and that's when we should be considering bringing in more of these lays to balance out the backs, to protect ourselves against short-term variance. So, if you have not been betting on player statistics, but you would like to, it's the kind of thing where, with enough accuracy in your model, or a model like we've got at Bookiebashing, if I can do a quick sell, then you can exploit the bookmakers, because there's a wide range of odds available. Just midweek at the beginning of this video, I did show that player who on the exchanges was 6.6, fair odds with 3.75. We know over a very large data set, historical data set, that those numbers are accurate. I don't blame anyone for looking at them and thinking, how can they be accurate? And I'm hoping this video can put some of those questions to bed. You could have got 6 to 1, 7.0 if you had a Sky Bet and you like betting on boosts at Sky Bet. It would have been a great bet. Didn't win because it was yesterday and it's taken long enough to do this video that it's the next day. It doesn't matter that it didn't win, of course. That's just a single bet that would have lost 75% of the time anyway. But regardless of that, we're getting 6 to 1 on those fair odds of 3.75. So I encourage you to take advantage of the world of player statistics, ride out the variance across a season, do some backing and some laying, make your own tool, come and use Bookiebashing if that's what you want to do, because there certainly is an edge. If you've got any questions on the mathematics, the analysis, or anything on this report, you can fire that into support@bookiebashing.net. The next deep dive will probably be maybe horse racing ahead of the Cheltenham Festival after half term, which will be coming up. But if there is actually a particular deep dive analysis, little bit of extra sort of information that you would like on data and betting and edges that we could do in a deep dive, send them in. Always interested to hear, and might give us some ideas for, you know, the next big analysis. And if you're not that interested in the deep dive and all you want to know is, well, he's the man with all the tips.
He's the one with all the tips. Winning horses.